Friends, will you pray with me? And as you feel so familiar and comfortable, I invite you to join in the second time through. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Amen. We hear again from Jeremiah this week. So note these texts, last week, this week, and the Jeremiah text we will read next week are all from the Revised Common Lectionary for about a month ago. So last week was the service and the scripture that I would have preached on my original candidacy Sunday that got delayed. So I decided to just stick with those texts since I didn't get to preach them the first time around. And so we have this text from Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. He's full of lament. As I mentioned last Sunday, Jeremiah is speaking out in a time where the people of Israel are preparing for the invasion of the Babylonians. And the eventual, and then living through the takeover of the Babylonians, and then heading into exile where they are sent from their land. Now, this text, though written so long ago and very much speaking to a specific situation that the people were facing, seems much the same way as last week's description of the potter and the wheel to somehow transcend the time that has passed since then, and really sort of brought up two very current situations for me today, or when I was reading it, really sort of reminded me. The first is as we are on the eve of Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly the holiday formerly known as named after that guy. That we are living in occupied land. That generations ago there were people in this land who perhaps had people that spoke, who had their own prophets, who said of a people who would come into the land with armies or weapons and would occupy it, and that they would be in exile. Now, our faith ancestors were only in exile for a relatively short amount of time. The ancestors in this land are many still in exile. I saw, and I didn't get a chance to get the source, but I saw a little quip this morning that said most school children can name the 3 ships that guy came on. How many of you can name those 3 ships? Right off the top of your head, what are they?
Pinta and Santa Maria.
The Pinta and Santa Maria. How many of you can name the people on whose land we are? The original people of this land that we're on today. Abenaki. There's 2 more. No, that's not one of the ones I know anyway. The Abenaki, the Pennacook, and the Wampanoag Confederacy, the sometimes called the Dawn Confederacy. I'm impressed that most of you know that I got a lot of Abenaki. That was really wonderful. Because that was the claim, that most school children can name the 3 ships, but cannot name the peoples whose land they inhabit. So it just makes me think. And I want to have that in our minds as we approach this scripture, and sort of the pain as we read these scriptures in Jeremiah and sort of preemptively understand the pain that people are going to go through, and we read other scriptures from the prophets who were from that time in exile, we just remember. And we acknowledge the part that our ancestors in faith, in the congregational tradition, our ancestors in New Hampshire and in New England and in this town, perhaps were part of. I know that I have done some genealogy research, and I do come from a long line of, English and Irish and Scottish folk who were here very early on, and who very much were potentially part of this issue and part of these situations. I had a moment, my husband was researching his ancestry, and he's looking back and he's like, oh, I think maybe, somebody was on the Mayflower. And I was like, oh, pilgrims. Which, of course, in the congregational tradition, especially coming up on certain holiday next month, we sort of celebrate and honor. This is, people are like, yes, I was a pilgrim on the Mayflower, and we get that. But I think it's also important to remember what that means. Acknowledge, remember, and potentially, as we go forward, to figure out ways to start to heal that relationship in some way. Now, speaking of healing, the time for all ages this morning was a little bit of a foreshadowing of the other thing that I heard when I read this passage. I read this passage and I thought, well, that sounds like a climate scientist to me. Honestly, that was the first thing I thought of. And reading this, I was reading through commentaries, and there's a lot of, struggle about one of the things I mentioned last week, the sort of the role that God plays in these sort of human-created situations, right? They're facing the invasion of the Babylonians, and they're, worried that it's God who is doing this to them and sending the armies, and they have to change their behavior. But what was interesting to me was I saw one commentary that said, this is not God doing these. This is God stepping back and saying, y'all did this to yourself. I'm done. I'm going to let the chips fall where they may. And if you don't want to listen, you don't want to listen to the prophets and messengers who have been sent to you over generation and generation to tell you how I want you to live in this world, then you can deal with the consequences. I mean, the comment about the stupid children is a little bit offensive. Because as you could tell, the children actually are pretty aware of what's going on. But this idea that we are acting as if we are ignorant of what is going on, as if we don't have the wisdom and knowledge, I think is a valid critique, even coming to us from generations ago. We have been told. We have been told what's going to happen. And the reality is, the worst predictions, turns out, not even close. Climate scientists now are looking at their reports and their predictions from decades ago and going, oh no, it's going to be much, much worse than we thought, and it's going to be faster. Because we're not listening. We're not taking action. I was looking at some of the IPCC report and the NOAA tracking of temperatures. And if you remember, though it's a little chilly this morning, but if you remember the summer, back when it was warm, and you remember the summer for the rest of the world. So July for the United States, for North America, was the third hottest July on record. The UK reached, for the very first time in ever recorded history, 104 degrees Fahrenheit in 5 different locations. Portugal had its third highest July on record. Places around the world, and the top 5 Julys are in the last decade. If If you look at the chart, you have these like little tiny like nicks like this in like the early 1900s. You're like, oh, a little warm, oh, there's a little cold, there's like a little warm. And then like from 1970 on, all the lines are like way up here and just keep arcing up. The prophets are speaking to us. They're telling us of how desolate the land will be. It's interesting that in this passage from Jeremiah, he's sort of mirroring creation. And this is why what Haley said was so interesting to me, because this is exactly what it is. It is a sort of backtracking of creation. It is going back to the waste and the void. It is taking away the birds of the air and the creatures of the sea and the inhabitants of the land. The thing is, we don't actually have a promise of a new planet, do we? Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, gets his name because he doesn't offer a whole lot of hope. Now, given his situation, you can probably understand why. Like, I'm warning you, oh no, we're in it. we're living it, we didn't do it, okay, now we're gonna just have to deal with it. But there's this tiny little line in there that said, it's not quite all out of hope yet. Where God is telling us, there's still a chance. I'm not coming in to save you. What falls, what happens, is going to be of your doing. But it's not hopeless yet. What is interesting in this passage, because of that, we usually focus in church on the hope of God. And God will always be there. Well, God will be with us. But the hope right now, in this situation, is in us. Is in us waking up and recognizing what's happening. Is in looking around us and seeing what a magnificent place we live in. What an amazing world we have been gifted. And deciding to take action to save it. To keep it from an undoing, which is what the path we're on it now is. To listen to the voices who are calling out. And to treat God's creation, which includes ourselves, with respect and care and love. It is possible. That IPCC report that came out, which I'm sure many of you heard about, there were reports, all kinds of, it was a lot of doom and gloom. It was very much like Jeremiah. But it's not final yet. And even in that report, they said, there are ways that we can turn this around, that we can stop the warming of the earth and move back. And some of them are really simple, like stop cutting down all the forests and plant new ones. Those two, right there, along with encouraging agricultural land, are the most effective ways of causing climate change. Because the thing is, just like Jeremiah knew, the image is of a desolate land, but he knew that the people were going to be the most affected. And we can see that happening already. And who, unfortunately, is the most affected when we have human-created disasters like wars or natural disasters, but the poor, the vulnerable, the children. And unfortunately, in this case, the people who are the least responsible for creating this situation, We look at Pakistan, which I know it's sort of in the media has already gone passé and nobody's talking about it anymore. But there's still places in Pakistan which are still underwater from their flooding this summer. Whole cities which are not inhabitable. People are camped in tents along roadsides. Now the death in these floods, the count is about 1,700 at the moment. But that's only just from the floodwaters and has not at all begun to include the count of those who are going to be dying from waterborne illnesses, from malaria, from all kinds of reasons, from hunger, as the farmlands and crops were wiped out. We look at closer to home, Hurricane Ian, and this massive storm surge. And we look in our recent memories and think about how common that's becoming. How many major hurricanes we get a year. How many bigger snowstorms or ice storms we get. You know, I can remember 2 maybe really major hurricanes from my childhood. Gloria and Andrew. How many do we have just in the last 10 years? You start forgetting their names because there are so many. But there's hope. There's hope in us. There's hope in the generation that is growing up with the knowledge and with the frustration of the generations before them, which have not acted. You think about the generations, the young kids in Jeremiah's time. What were they thinking? How did they change based on the events of their lives? Maybe it will not change in your generation or mine, but our actions now will absolutely have an effect on the children who are growing up and the generations to come after us. In this one, God is tapping out. It's up to us. God will accompany us, whatever decisions we make, but God's not stepping in to save the maple trees and the bluebirds and the minnows. We have to, and soon. Now let us raise our voices and ask for guidance in our hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, which is number 276 in our hymn list.